Sometimes the biggest mistake of your life turns out to be the one your heart has been waiting to make. The first thing I noticed was the sound of sunlight slipping through partially open curtains and warming the quiet hotel room. The second was the unfamiliar wedding band resting on my left hand. I stared at it for several long seconds, convinced I was still dreaming, until a soft groan beside me pulled my attention toward the other side of the bed. Lauren Brooks slowly opened her eyes, brushing loose strands of chestnut hair away from her face before freezing completely. Her gaze moved from the room to me, then finally to the ring on her own hand. Neither of us spoke. We had known each other for nearly a decade. She was my closest friend outside the demanding world of boardrooms and shareholders, the one person who never seemed impressed by my title or my company. I was the billionaire chief executive officer everyone believed had every answer. Lauren was the interior designer who somehow made every room feel welcoming simply by stepping inside it. We had traveled together before, attended conferences together, celebrated promotions and birthdays together, but we had never shared a hotel room, and we certainly had never expected to wake up wearing matching wedding bands in the middle of Las Vegas. Lauren sat up slowly, looking around the elegant suite with complete disbelief. "Victoria," she whispered carefully, "please tell me there is a perfectly reasonable explanation for this." I wished I had one. Instead, I noticed a cream-colored envelope resting neatly on the bedside table beside 2 glasses of water. My name and Lauren's name were written together across the front in elegant handwriting. Before either of us reached for it, another object caught my attention. A framed marriage certificate stood beside the envelope as though someone wanted to make absolutely certain we would see it the moment we opened our eyes. I climbed out of bed, my heartbeat noticeably faster than usual, and carefully picked up the certificate. The official seal of Clark County reflected the morning sunlight. Every signature appeared genuine. Every date matched yesterday. Every detail insisted that sometime during the previous evening Lauren Brooks and Victoria Hayes had legally become spouses. Lauren quietly stepped beside me, reading every line over my shoulder. "This cannot be real," she murmured. I looked toward her, hoping she would suddenly remember something I had forgotten, but the uncertainty in her eyes mirrored my own. The previous night remained scattered into disconnected fragments. A celebration after a leadership conference. Bright lights along the Las Vegas Strip. Laughter. Music drifting from somewhere beyond an outdoor terrace. A long conversation that neither of us could fully recall. After that, everything disappeared into an impossible blur. Lauren gently touched the wedding band on her finger before looking back at me. "Do you remember agreeing to this?" she asked. I slowly shook my head. No. The answer felt unsettling because I prided myself on remembering every important decision I had ever made. Yet standing there beside my closest friend, I could not explain the most unexpected commitment of my entire life. Lauren carefully lifted the cream-colored envelope from the table. Her hands paused when she noticed another object beneath it, a small wooden box polished until it reflected the morning light. Delicate brass hinges framed the lid, and a simple handwritten note rested across the top. We exchanged another uncertain glance before I picked up the note and quietly read the message aloud. "Open only when you are together." Lauren looked from the box to the wedding ring still resting on our hands. Then she whispered the one question neither of us could answer. "Who knew we would wake up like this before we did?" Lauren continued staring at the small wooden box as though opening it might somehow explain the impossible morning we had just awakened to. The elegant hotel suite remained perfectly quiet except for the distant sounds of Las Vegas beginning another day beyond the windows. Neither of us reached for the lid immediately. We had always been good at making careful decisions together, and somehow even now, surrounded by unanswered questions, that habit remained unchanged. "If someone wanted us to find this together," Lauren said softly, "then maybe we should follow the instructions exactly." I nodded in agreement. We carried the box to the small dining table near the windows where sunlight filled the room with a calm warmth that felt strangely comforting. I carefully lifted the brass latch while Lauren unfolded the cream-colored envelope resting beside it. Inside the box were several neatly tied bundles of handwritten letters, each secured with a faded blue ribbon. On top rested a single card written in the same elegant handwriting. Read one letter at a time. Do not skip ahead. Lauren looked at me with quiet confusion. These are old. She gently lifted the first bundle. The paper had softened with age, and the envelope showed tiny signs of having been carried from place to place over many years. My heartbeat became noticeably steadier, replaced by curiosity instead of panic. Whatever had happened the night before, these letters clearly mattered long before we arrived in Nevada. Lauren opened the cream-colored envelope while I untied the first ribbon. A short note slipped into her hand. She read silently for a moment before looking up. It says these letters were never delivered because they were written during moments when honesty felt too frightening. It also says we asked someone to keep them safe until the day we were both ready to read them. I frowned slightly. We asked someone? She nodded slowly. Apparently together. That answer only deepened the mystery. I carefully unfolded the first handwritten letter. My own name appeared across the top in familiar handwriting that instantly caught my attention. This is yours, Lauren whispered. I recognized it immediately. It was my handwriting from years earlier, slightly less polished than it was today, written with the same fountain pen I had carried throughout my early years as a chief executive officer. I quietly began reading aloud. Dear Lauren, today you reminded me that success feels surprisingly empty when there is nobody who knows the person behind the title. Thank you for always speaking to Victoria instead of the chief executive officer. I stopped reading, unable to continue for several seconds. I had absolutely no memory of writing those words. Lauren remained silent, giving me the space to process what I was holding. I wrote this? I asked almost to myself. She nodded gently. It sounds like you. I smiled faintly. Maybe it does. Lauren reached for another envelope resting beneath mine. Her expression changed the moment she saw the handwriting. This one is mine. She slowly unfolded the paper and took a careful breath before reading. Dear Victoria, every time people call you fearless, I smile because they never see the woman who quietly worries about everyone else before herself. I wish you knew how much easier you make other people's lives simply by believing in them. She paused, blinking as emotion quietly settled across her face. Neither of us remembered writing these letters. Yet every sentence sounded completely authentic, as though our hearts had preserved memories our minds had somehow forgotten. We looked at the remaining bundles resting inside the wooden box, suddenly realizing they contained years of conversations that had never actually been spoken aloud. Then Lauren noticed something written beneath the final ribbon, and her voice dropped to little more than a whisper. The last letter has a date. I looked closer. It was yesterday's date. Neither of us reached for the final letter dated yesterday. It remained beneath the blue ribbon inside the wooden box like a promise we had not yet earned. Instead, we quietly followed the instructions and continued reading the older letters in the order they had been arranged. Every page seemed to come from a different chapter of our lives, each revealing a memory that had always existed beneath ordinary conversations but had never been spoken aloud. Hours passed without either of us noticing. Outside the hotel windows, the brilliant lights of Las Vegas had given way to a bright desert morning, yet inside the peaceful sweet time seemed suspended between the past and the present. The next letter I opened had been written nearly 6 years earlier, shortly after the first international expansion of my company. I slowly read the words aloud. Dear Lauren, today everyone congratulated me for another successful milestone. Cameras flashed, reporters smiled, and investors celebrated. Then I came home to an empty penthouse and realized the only person I wanted to tell was you. I never called because I did not want to interrupt your evening. Sometimes I wonder if success teaches people how to be admired without teaching them how to stop feeling lonely. My voice became quieter near the end. Lauren looked toward the city beyond the window before speaking. You never told me any of that. I smiled sadly. Apparently I wrote letters instead. She gently reached for another envelope tied beneath the same ribbon. This one is from the year I opened my own design studio. She unfolded the paper with careful hands before reading. Dear Victoria, everyone keeps saying I built this business by myself. They do not know that every time I doubted my abilities, you quietly reminded me that courage is simply continuing before confidence arrives. You have always believed in me more than I believed in myself. I wish you understood how much that has meant. She lowered the letter into her lap, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. It was astonishing how accurately our younger selves had understood emotions we had somehow managed to avoid discussing in person. Do you think we really intended to send these? Lauren finally asked. I considered the question carefully. I think we intended to. I also think we were afraid of changing what already existed between us. She nodded slowly. So we kept choosing friendship because it felt safer. The realization settled gently between us. There was no bitterness in it, only quiet understanding. We continued reading throughout the afternoon, discovering letters written after birthdays, business setbacks, family celebrations, and quiet victories neither of us had realized the other remembered so vividly. Each page revealed another hidden thread connecting our lives long before we ever imagined waking up wearing matching wedding bands. As evening approached, I closed the final letter from the older bundle and looked once more at the single envelope dated yesterday. The handwriting looked steadier than the others, almost peaceful. Lauren carefully traced the edge of the envelope without opening it. Whatever happened last night, she whispered, I do not think it began in Las Vegas. I slowly nodded because I had reached the same conclusion. The wedding certificate, the rings, and the mysterious wooden box suddenly felt less like the beginning of an unbelievable story and more like the final chapter of one that had quietly been unfolding for years. Then I noticed something written in small handwriting beneath yesterday's date that neither of us had seen before. It was only one short sentence, but it made us both stop breathing for a moment. Read this only after you remember why you both said yes. The sentence beneath the final envelope stayed in my thoughts long after we closed the wooden box. Neither of us suggested opening it. For the first time since waking in the hotel suite, it felt as though we were no longer chasing answers but earning them one memory at a time. Lauren looked toward the Las Vegas skyline glowing beyond the windows and quietly smiled. If we really promised not to read that letter until we remembered, then I think we should keep that promise. I nodded without hesitation. It felt strangely comforting to trust two versions of ourselves we could no longer completely remember. We spent the rest of the afternoon retracing the previous evening as carefully as possible. Receipts found inside my jacket led us to a small cafe overlooking the Bellagio fountains where we had apparently shared dessert after the leadership conference. The manager recognized us immediately and greeted us with a warm smile. You two came in just before closing, he said. You stayed for nearly 2 hours. Lauren exchanged a surprised glance with me. Did we seem happy? She asked. The manager laughed softly. Very. Mostly you talked. I remember thinking it looked like two old friends finally saying things they had been holding on to for years. Those words settled gently inside both of us. We thanked him and continued walking through the familiar streets, following the timeline printed on small receipts and photographs stored on our phones. None of the pictures explained the marriage itself, yet every image showed the same thing. We were smiling naturally. There were no signs of reckless celebration or confusion, only quiet conversations beneath colorful lights and peaceful moments that looked almost ordinary. As evening approached, we reached a small public garden behind one of the hotels. Lauren stopped beside a wooden bench surrounded by flowering trees and looked around with growing recognition. I remember this place, she whispered. I sat beside her without speaking. She closed her eyes for a moment before smiling faintly. We came here because it was quieter than the casinos. Another memory surfaced inside my own mind, not complete but clear enough to feel real. I remembered Lauren laughing as a gentle breeze scattered flower petals across the path. I remembered telling her that every important decision in my life had been made inside conference rooms except the ones that truly mattered. Lauren slowly opened her eyes. You asked me something here. My heartbeat quickened. I think I did. She nodded thoughtfully. You asked whether I had ever wondered what our lives would look like if we had been brave enough to stop pretending we were only friends. Neither of us spoke after that. The silence carried no uncertainty now, only the quiet realization that fragments of the truth were finally returning. We continued walking until we reached a small wedding chapel tucked between larger buildings. Its entrance looked simple rather than extravagant, decorated with white flowers and warm lights that had not yet been turned on for the evening. I stared at the doorway, and another memory quietly emerged. Lauren and I had stood there holding the wooden box together. An elderly woman had smiled at us before handing it over. "You promised me you would wait until morning," she had said. Lauren looked at me with widening eyes. "I remember her." I slowly nodded. "So do I." We still could not remember everything that happened after that moment, but one truth had become impossible to ignore. Whatever decision we made inside that chapel had not been impulsive. It had been preceded by years of unwritten conversations, unread letters, and one unforgettable night in which two lifelong friends had finally found the courage to begin telling each other the truth. The following morning we boarded an early flight back to San Francisco carrying far more questions than luggage. The wooden box rested carefully inside my carry-on bag, untouched throughout the journey because neither of us wanted to break the promise written beneath the final envelope. As the airplane climbed above the Nevada desert, Lauren quietly looked through the window while golden sunlight stretched across the clouds. "Do you think we should have the marriage annulled as soon as we land?" she asked gently. The question sounded practical, exactly the kind of conversation I normally handled without hesitation, yet this time the answer refused to come. "I think we should understand why we made the decision before we decide whether to undo it," I replied. Lauren slowly nodded. "That sounds like something you would say." I smiled faintly. "Usually it does." When we landed, the familiar skyline of San Francisco welcomed us home, but everything felt slightly different than it had only 3 days earlier. We drove together in comfortable silence until we reached my office building. Before either of us left the car, my attorney called exactly as scheduled. She had already received official notification of the marriage certificate through routine legal updates connected to my personal records. "Congratulations," she said warmly before noticing my unusual silence. "Or perhaps I should ask how you are feeling." I exchanged a quick glance with Lauren before answering honestly. "Still trying to understand what happened." My attorney listened patiently while I explained that we needed time before making any legal decisions. She responded with calm professionalism. "There is no immediate deadline. If you decide to request an annulment or continue the marriage, we can discuss everything after you have had time to think." After ending the call, Lauren remained quiet for several moments. "I expected you to schedule the paperwork immediately," she admitted. I rested both hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine again. "So did I." We looked at each other, and for the first time since Las Vegas, neither of us felt pressured to find the perfect answer. Instead, we agreed on something much simpler. We would continue living our normal lives for a little while longer, meeting for coffee, talking honestly, and allowing the missing memories to return naturally instead of forcing them. During the following week we found ourselves spending time together more often than ever before, not because a marriage certificate required it, but because every conversation seemed to reveal another forgotten piece of our shared history. One evening Lauren discovered an old photograph inside her apartment while organizing a bookshelf. It showed us standing together at a charity event nearly 5 years earlier, laughing at something beyond the camera. Written on the back in my handwriting were the words, "You always make crowded rooms feel like home." Lauren sent me a picture of the note, and I realized I had completely forgotten writing it. Later that same night I found an unopened notebook inside my study. Tucked between its pages was a pressed wildflower carefully preserved beside another short sentence written years before. "One day I hope courage catches up with my heart." I closed the notebook slowly, understanding that the woman who had written those words had already known the truth long before I was ready to admit it. The next afternoon Lauren met me at the small park overlooking the bay where we often escaped after busy workdays. She smiled as she approached, then quietly slipped her hand into mine without saying a single word. It felt completely natural. We sat together watching sailboats move peacefully across the water until Lauren finally broke the silence. I think we are remembering something important. I gently squeezed her hand. I think we are remembering ourselves. Neither of us mentioned annulment again, because somewhere between forgotten letters, returning memories, and quiet afternoons beside the bay, the question had slowly changed from whether we should remain married to whether we had ever truly been anything other than two people patiently finding their way toward each other. Another week passed, and with every ordinary day our extraordinary situation felt less confusing and more quietly meaningful. We still had not opened the final letter resting inside the wooden box because neither of us believed we had fully remembered everything it had asked us to remember. Instead, we continued allowing the truth to return naturally. One Friday evening Lauren invited me to her apartment after work, saying she had found something while organizing old storage boxes. The moment I arrived, she placed a worn scrapbook on the coffee table between us. Inside were ticket stubs, photographs, handwritten notes, and small souvenirs collected over nearly 10 years of friendship. I smiled as I recognized a pressed maple leaf from our first hiking trip together, a receipt from the tiny bookstore where we had spent an entire rainy afternoon, and a faded conference badge from the leadership event where we first realized how easily we worked as a team. I forgot we kept all of this, I said quietly. Lauren laughed. Apparently we never forgot as much as we thought. We slowly turned each page together until a folded restaurant menu slipped onto the floor. On the back, written in my handwriting, were the words, "If we ever stop pretending to be too busy, I think we could have an incredible life." I stared at the sentence, and suddenly another memory returned with remarkable clarity. I remembered writing those words after dinner nearly 3 years earlier. Lauren had fallen asleep during the drive home after finishing a demanding renovation project, and I had quietly written the sentence while waiting for her to wake up. I never gave it to her because I convinced myself friendship was already too valuable to risk. Lauren looked at me with gentle surprise. "You almost told me then." I nodded slowly. "I almost did." She smiled before walking toward a small cabinet beside the window. From the top drawer she removed a tiny velvet pouch. Inside rested 2 simple silver keychains shaped like tiny envelopes. "Do you remember these?" she asked. The instant I saw them, another forgotten piece of the previous week returned. Standing beneath the bright lights of Las Vegas, we had found a small gift shop after leaving the peaceful garden. We bought the matching keychains because they reminded us of the letters we had never exchanged. Lauren quietly laughed as the memory settled between us. We promised we would finally stop keeping important things unsaid. My heart became unexpectedly light. That was before the chapel. She nodded. Yes. More memories followed naturally after that. We remembered sitting together outside the small wedding chapel for nearly an hour, talking honestly about every letter we had never mailed, every feeling we had quietly protected, and every opportunity we had allowed to pass because we feared changing our friendship. There had been no reckless celebration, no impulsive decision, and no dramatic moment. Instead, an elderly wedding officiant had simply asked one question after listening to our conversation. "If you already know your hearts, what exactly are you waiting for?" Lauren smiled as tears of quiet happiness filled her eyes. "That is when we looked at each other." I finished the memory with her. "And we both said we were tired of waiting." The room became wonderfully quiet. For the first time since waking in Las Vegas, every important piece finally fit together. We had not accidentally stumbled into marriage. We had thoughtfully walked toward it after years of friendship and one unforgettable night of complete honesty. Lauren looked toward the wooden box resting on the bookshelf and gently reached for my hand. "I think we remember now." I looked at the final unopened envelope waiting patiently inside the box, and for the first time it no longer felt mysterious. It felt like the last page of a story that our hearts had already begun writing long before either of us found the courage to read it. Lauren carefully lifted the wooden box from the bookshelf and placed it between us on the coffee table. Evening sunlight filtered through the apartment windows, painting soft golden reflections across the polished wood. Neither of us rushed. After everything we had remembered, opening the final envelope no longer felt like solving a mystery. It felt like honoring a promise we had made to ourselves. I slowly untied the faded blue ribbon while Lauren rested her hand gently over mine. "Ready?" she asked quietly. I smiled. "I think we have been ready for years." Together we opened the final envelope dated the day we had married. The handwriting was instantly familiar because this letter belonged to both of us. Instead of one voice, it carried two. The first paragraph had been written by me. "If we are reading this tomorrow, it means we finally stopped hiding behind perfect timing. We spent years convincing ourselves that friendship was enough because neither of us wanted to risk losing the other. Tonight we finally admitted the truth. We were never afraid of love. We were afraid of changing a relationship that already meant everything." Lauren quietly continued reading the next paragraph written in her own handwriting. "If you wake up tomorrow wondering whether this was a mistake, please remember how peaceful you felt before we walked into the chapel. Remember that nobody pressured us. Nobody expected anything from us. We chose this because honesty finally became easier than silence." My eyes lingered on the page while another memory returned with complete clarity. I remembered standing outside the small chapel just before midnight. We had not been laughing wildly or acting impulsively. Instead, we had been sitting together beneath strings of warm lights, reading several of the old letters for the very first time after an elderly family friend unexpectedly handed us the wooden box she had safeguarded for years at our request. We had thanked her, read until tears and laughter blended together, and quietly realized that every important feeling had already existed long before that night. Lauren looked at me, smiling through tears that reflected relief more than sadness. "We really did choose this." I nodded. "Every step." We continued reading the final page together. "If you are still wearing the rings tomorrow, keep wearing them only if they continue to represent truth. Marriage is not the ending of this story. It is simply permission to stop pretending that your hearts have been traveling together for years." The room became completely still after the last sentence. There was nothing left to question because every missing piece had found its place. A gentle knock at the apartment door interrupted the quiet moment. When Lauren opened it, she smiled warmly. Standing outside was our longtime friend Grace, the retired family friend who had often encouraged both of us to speak more honestly throughout the years. She noticed the opened envelope resting on the table and immediately understood. "So you finally read the last one," she said with a knowing smile. I laughed softly. "You knew all along." Grace nodded gently. "I knew you trusted each other long before either of you trusted yourselves." She stayed only a few minutes, wishing us happiness before quietly leaving us alone again. After the door closed, Lauren walked back toward the window overlooking the evening skyline of San Francisco. I joined her, and together we watched the city lights slowly appear one by one beneath the fading sunset. There were no dramatic speeches waiting to be made and no impossible decisions left unresolved. Lauren looked at our wedding bands catching the last rays of daylight and smiled. "I used to think the most important thing we lost in Las Vegas was our memory." I gently intertwined my fingers with hers. "Now I think the most important thing we found was the courage to finally believe what had been true all along." The weeks that followed felt wonderfully ordinary, and perhaps that was the greatest surprise of all. Nothing about our lives became dramatic after we finally remembered the truth. Instead, every ordinary moment gained a quiet meaning it had never carried before. Lauren still arrived at her design studio before 8 each morning, greeting coworkers with the same warm smile that had always made people feel welcome. I still spent long hours inside conference rooms making difficult decisions for my company, but now there was always one message waiting on my phone before every important meeting. "Good luck. You have already done the hard part." It was a simple tradition Lauren had started without ever announcing it, and somehow it became the calmest part of every demanding day. One evening we met at our favorite cafe overlooking the bay, the same place where we had shared countless conversations as friends long before Las Vegas changed the way we understood them. We carried our coffee outside and watched the late afternoon sun shimmer across the water while sailboats drifted slowly toward the marina. Do you ever wish we had realized all of this sooner? Lauren asked quietly. I considered the question for several moments before answering. Sometimes. Then I remember that every letter, every conversation, and every year brought us here exactly as we are now. She smiled thoughtfully. Maybe we needed time to become the people who could finally understand those letters. I nodded. I think so. A few days later my attorney called again, gently reminding me that there was still no pressure to make any legal changes if we wished to continue our marriage exactly as it stood. After ending the call, I looked across my office toward the city skyline before dialing Lauren's number. Can you meet me after work? I asked. Of course, she answered immediately. We met in the small botanical garden where we often escaped whenever life became too busy. Flowers bloomed along winding paths while families and friends enjoyed the peaceful evening around us. I reached into my handbag and placed the legal documents on the bench between us. Lauren looked at them without touching the folder. Is this the paperwork? She asked softly. Yes. She remained silent, waiting for me to continue. I smiled before closing the folder again. I brought it because I wanted us to make this decision together. Lauren studied my face with the same gentle honesty that had carried us through every stage of our journey. And what decision have you already made? She asked. I laughed quietly because she had always known me too well. I realized something this morning. I reached for her hand. The marriage certificate stopped feeling like an unexpected event a long time ago. Now it simply feels like a truthful description of where our hearts have been heading for years. Lauren's eyes filled with quiet happiness. Then we agree. I looked at her curiously. She smiled. I never wanted to erase the beginning of our story. I only wanted to understand it. We left the unopened legal folder on the bench for a few moments while we walked slowly through the gardens, talking about future vacations, family dinners, new design projects, and ordinary weekends that suddenly felt more exciting than any celebration in Las Vegas ever could. As the evening sky turned shades of gold and lavender above the trees, I realized the greatest change in our lives was not the wedding itself. It was the simple freedom of no longer wondering whether the person walking beside me truly belonged there. We had spent years searching for certainty inside unread letters and forgotten memories, only to discover that the answer had quietly appeared every single time we chose to walk forward together. 1 year later Lauren and I returned to Las Vegas on a quiet autumn weekend, not because we wanted to relive confusion, but because we wanted to celebrate the place where two lifelong friends had finally chosen complete honesty. The city looked exactly as I remembered, filled with bright lights, welcoming laughter, and endless movement, yet this time every familiar street carried peace instead of uncertainty. We checked into the very same hotel where our extraordinary morning had begun. The receptionist smiled warmly after recognizing our reservation and quietly congratulated us on our anniversary. Lauren looked at me with an amused smile as we stepped into the elevator. Last time we arrived with unanswered questions, she said. I gently squeezed her hand. This time we brought all the answers with us. The hotel suite looked almost unchanged. Sunlight still poured through the large windows, the same dining table stood beside the balcony, and the quiet atmosphere felt strangely comforting rather than mysterious. Lauren placed the carefully preserved wooden box on the table between us. Inside, every letter remained exactly where we had returned it after reading them together months earlier. We untied the faded blue ribbons once more, not because we needed to remember, but because we wanted to honor every version of ourselves that had quietly written those words before either of us possessed enough courage to speak them aloud. We reread several favorite letters, smiling at forgotten details, laughing at nervous sentences, and appreciating how patiently our younger selves had protected feelings they were not yet ready to share. Later that afternoon we walked back through the peaceful garden where our memories had first begun returning. The same wooden bench remained beneath the flowering trees, and a gentle breeze carried familiar petals across the pathway. Lauren sat beside me, looking toward the quiet chapel in the distance before softly asking, "Do you remember the first question you asked me that night?" I smiled immediately because this memory had become one of my favorites. I asked whether you had ever wondered what our lives would look like if we stopped pretending we were only friends. Lauren laughed warmly. And I answered that I wondered almost every day. We continued walking until we reached the small chapel where everything had changed. The elderly officiant had long since retired, but the building still welcomed visitors seeking simple ceremonies and meaningful promises. We stood outside the entrance together without saying very much because words no longer felt necessary. Every important conversation had already happened. Lauren looked down at the wedding band resting comfortably on her hand before turning toward me. For months I thought the most unbelievable part of our story was waking up married. I smiled gently. What do you think now? She looked into my eyes with complete certainty. Now I think the unbelievable part is that two people could love each other so faithfully for so many years before realizing they had already built the life they were searching for. We returned to the hotel just before sunset, carrying the wooden box one final time. Instead of placing it back inside the closet, we set it permanently on a bookshelf overlooking the room. It no longer represented unanswered questions. It represented courage, patience, friendship, and every quiet choice that had eventually led us home to each other. As evening settled across the Las Vegas skyline, I looked toward Lauren and smiled. Do you remember what you asked me the morning we woke up here? She laughed softly. I asked why we were married. I nodded. And now? She stepped closer, gently taking both of my hands. Now I know we were never brought together by one unexpected morning. We were brought together by every ordinary day before it, every unread letter, every honest conversation, and every moment we quietly chose each other without even realizing it. The city lights slowly appeared beyond the windows while the wooden box rested peacefully beside us, no longer holding mysteries, only memories. Sometimes the greatest love stories do not begin when two people fall in love. Sometimes they begin the moment two lifelong friends finally discover that love had been patiently waiting inside their hearts all along.